Inflation in the United States slows slightly, but is the global economy headed for a perfect storm with the US, China and Europe experiencing economic challenges? Hello, I'm Arnold Neidem and this is The Heat. US consumer prices rose at a slightly slower pace in April, topping at 8.3%, down from 8.5% in March. Supply issues kept inflation near its highest level in 40 years. Economists say the pandemic and the Ukraine conflict are largely to blame. CGTN's White House correspondent Nathan King has more in this report.
Inflation at the consumer level still very high on the April reading at an annualized basis, up 8.3% in the US, less than the 8.5% we saw the month before, but more than expected. I think the consensus was around 8.1%. Now, all these numbers really don't mean much to the American consumer until you break it down like this. We made a list of stuff that's gone up and how much more it's gone up in the last year. Flour, 14%, milk, nearly 15%, coffee, nearly 14%, butter, over 15%, meat, 14%, and eggs, 22.5%. Also, we've seen rising energy costs, and even though they dipped a little bit, they are back up. In fact, in the last 24 hours or so, the US has recorded its highest ever, although not adjusted for inflation, price at the pump. I think it's something like $4.37 a gallon to fill up your car, which globally isn't much. US gas prices are generally low, but for Americans, I can tell you the sticker shock is incredible. So Joe Biden out in the heartland in Illinois, talking to farmers and food processors. Now, he has said that he wants to battle inflation last week, but he's still trying to point the blame elsewhere, calling it Putin's price hike.
Right now, America is fighting on two fronts. At home, it's inflation and rising prices. Abroad, it's helping Ukrainians defend their democracy and feeding those who are left hungry around the world because Russian atrocities exist. And Jeff and the American farmers understand Putin's war has cut off critical sources of food.
Now, as we know, these inflation worries and supply chain shocks that we saw during COVID happened many months before the war in Ukraine. Partly they have been exacerbated by that, but this is a very big electoral issue now for Joe Biden as he goes into the midterm elections here in November, where the Democrats stand to lose potentially both houses of Congress. So it is a big deal. What could help? Well, they could get rid of the tariffs on Chinese goods. US researchers say it could knock about 1.5% off that inflation rate. But generally, we are seeing supply shocks, we are seeing supply problems, we are seeing people's wages rise, but when you factor in inflation, they're actually going down. This is not a good electoral scenario for Joe Biden, and he knows it. Nathan King, CGTN, just outside the White House.
Well, there is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Ryan Patel is a global business executive and board director with Claremont Graduate University's Drucker School of Management. John Gong is an economics professor at the University of International Business and Economics. Also with us is David Bailey. He's a business economics professor at the University of Birmingham. And John Quelch is dean of the University of Miami's Herbert Business School. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. John Quelch, let's start right here in the United States, and let's look at those numbers again. Inflation slowed down just a bit last month, down to 8.3% from 8.5% in March. But core consumer prices rose more than expected. So, John, where are the economic pressures coming from? As we heard, President Biden says it's the pandemic and the Ukraine conflict, but what's your view on this?
Well, of course, it's the pandemic. Of course, it's the supply chain problems that we've experienced in relation to the pandemic. It's partly a function of the Ukraine war limiting supplies of grains and potentially energy as well. But it's also a function of the very substantial stimulus programs that the federal government put in defense of COVID. So all of these factors have contributed to inflation. And the question is now whether or not we're in a wage price spiral where price increases result in workers demanding more wages, and those wages then have to be passed on to the consumers of the products or services that those employees are responsible to, and end up causing a potential wage price spiral. We're not quite there yet, but it is a definite source of concern. And if I may just add one thing, Anand, you know, consumption is 2/3 of the U.S. economy, but it's split really down the middle between two groups of people. There is 1/3 of people who do 2/3 of the spending, and 2/3 of people do 1/3 of the spending. The latter group is really hit hard by food price inflation, by energy inflation. The first group is immunized a little bit by their extra wealth and earning power. Right. But now that the stock market is collapsing, that group is also feeling increasingly skittish and likely to cut back on spending as well. And that may soften or dampen demand so that the Fed doesn't have to raise rates quite as aggressively as might have been predicted by some people.
John Quelch, one other point, and that is, and this is something that's probably on the minds of most people, and that is, when can we expect some relief? I mean, the president did tell us, President Biden that is, he did tell us that this rise in inflation would be short-lived. In fact, the Washington Post said that belief is something akin to magical thinking. But when can we expect some kind of relief?
I don't think we can expect relief until the Fed goes through a series of rate increases of 0.5% per increase that brings the funds rate to somewhere between 2.5 and 3%. That will be a rate neutral situation, which essentially means that the Fed is neither stimulating nor dampening demand. When that point is reached, there may be some relief, but by the point that that is reached, inflation may be still at the 9 or 8% level. And of course, we all know as economists that unless the interest rates are equivalent to or above inflation, it's very difficult to tame inflation.
David Bailey, great to have you with us. Welcome to the show. Let's get back to something that we talked about right at the beginning of the show, and that is the United States, China, and Europe. They're all facing economic headwinds. And, you know, let's look at that question that we posed at that point where we said, is the global economy headed for this perfect storm right now?
It certainly seems like it. And I think what John was referring to then was whether the US can engineer a soft landing or not. It's had a good track record in previous recessions of doing that, but this time it's a lot more difficult, partly because we have these global headwinds. So in the case of the United Kingdom, we're already into stagflation, so both stagnation and inflation. The Bank of England forecasting probably the biggest squeeze on living standards in decades, if not ever, and a decline in the economy of something like 0.25% this year. For the rest of Europe, so for the European Union, they're not in quite as bad a position, but the European Central Bank has indicated that it will stop buying bonds and is looking to increase interest rates. So previously, I thought the difference between Europe and the US was really the US faced inflationary pressure. It needed to control that, although there's, I think, increasingly a risk of recession. For Europe, it's the risk of inflation and recession. Now, both of those things feed through to China in the sense that the increase in inflation reduces the real spending power of consumers and impacts on exports from China. And that's slowing the Chinese economy, along with all of the supply chain disruption from COVID lockdown. So all of these things are interlinked, but it certainly seems like, you know, we're essentially seeing a shock to the global economy.
David, let me ask you that question that I put to John Quelch. I mean, when do you think we'd see some kind of relief? When do you see this making the turn? I mean, what are the markers that you would be looking for?
So in the case of the UK, Bank of England is also forecast to increase interest rates over the next year or two. It may be a slower process in the European Union. Remember that in the European Union, the actual deposit rate is in negative territory because previously the fear in Europe was of deflation. So I think it's going to take a couple of years to work its way through. I think one of the big issues is really from a Chinese point of view as to how quickly they can get through this kind of COVID lockdown and disruption, and whether they need to change their vaccination policy.
Okay, let's get more on that from John Gong. John is in Tel Aviv. John, as David mentioned right now, it depends on when China gets to take control of the COVID pandemic right now. It has hit economic activity in China, as we are fully aware. Now, according to China Daily, Premier Li Keqiang is warning of a, quote, complicated and grave employment situation while urging officials to prioritize measures at helping business retain jobs. How has China been impacted?
Well, unfortunately, I don't have a very good answer, actually. I don't see this pandemic thing is going to end anytime soon. I think that even if, these very restrictive measures were effective to contain this, which I still have my fair share of skepticism, actually. How can we make sure that this is not going to come back again? We all know that this virus, Omicron, is not going to go away. In most parts of the world, the situation is going to be coexistent. So, China cannot stay there forever, pretty much isolated at this point. So I think as soon as the country opens, the problem will come back again. So, in short, I think this pandemic thing is going to be a real challenge in my view. There's going to be some debate about the policies and also the measures, but I don't see these things will be addressed anytime soon. So at least an impact on the economy, I think the impact of the pandemic is still going to be there for some time. Now, the question about unemployment, as Premier Li Keqiang has raised, I think it's even secondary. The fact of the matter is that in many cities in China at this point, companies are not full back to operation, and the employment problem is going to be there. It cannot be addressed, in my view, without the pandemic issue being addressed. So it's a very difficult, challenging situation. The government is doing its best, but I think it's just too powerful a virus, and I think the current tools probably need to be thought about again, and the government needs to come up with a more effective solution, a more effective strategy to tackle this. At this point, I think the second quarter data statistics about the GDP growth, but exports definitely are not going to be good.
Right. So, John Gong, one of the figures that people will be looking at very closely is that projected growth rate for the year of 5.5%. I mean, the general feeling is that China will meet that growth rate. Do you think it will?
Well, the first quarter is 4.8. It's short by a little bit. The second quarter, we haven't known the number yet, but my guess is that I'll be very happy if it's even positive. We know the second quarter number is not going to be good. The question is whether the third quarter, the fourth quarter, if they are good, we'll be able to make up the losses in the first two quarters. And I think it's a tall order, unless the government does something really drastic, and the situation on the ground improves. I mean, in terms of the pandemic situation improves. Right. We might still have some hope, but at this point, it's still too early to say that it's still achievable or not. I think it's a tall order.
Ryan, there was a recent survey done, and it shows that China's COVID cases, as well as the Ukraine conflict, are creating severe challenges for European businesses that are operating in China. Nearly a quarter of those surveyed are considering shifting their planned investments out of China to other countries. I mean, what is your reading of the situation?
Well, I think this is prior to even the lockdown, truthfully, and I mean, many European companies and even U.S. companies have already started to look at, what supply chain B looks like or Plan B looks like. And I don't think it's just China specifically, but to meet the demand, which has been increasing, you would say kind of post in the last 6 months, companies had to figure out ways, and European companies had to figure out ways to meet the demand. They had to if they wanted to stay in business. And this is how I read the situation. Isn't so much that, well, China's closed and they have to move. It's European companies going, well, I have a demand, I can't meet it. how, you've got to solve for it. You can't wait for it anymore, and you need answers. And I think that's what you're seeing right now with the pressures on all these variables back to the companies going, you need to find a solution, not 6 months from now, but now, to be able to handle and stay in business.
John Quelch, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, it says that the Ukraine crisis will curb trade and growth this year. Now, let's look at Ukraine itself. It's one of the world's biggest exporters of grain. 25 million tons are now sitting in storage. They're unable to access it. This is what Peter Nagel of the World Bank had to say on that and on rising wheat prices. Let's listen.
For food, the big action is in wheat prices, where we expect a 40% increase in 2022. Now, that reflects the importance of Russia and Ukraine as exporters. Together, they account for around 1/4 of global wheat exports. And particularly exports from Ukraine have been interrupted by the war. Now, this is a particular issue for countries in the Middle East and North Africa, since they rely on Russia and Ukraine for a very large share of their wheat imports. The other important aspect in food markets is the price of fertilizers. So fertilizers are made from natural gas, and so the surge in prices we've seen in natural gas has also pushed up the price of fertilizers.
So, John Quelch, that's a very dire situation being described there by the World Bank. I mean, can anything be done in the short term?
Certainly it's a dire situation, and of course the principal countries affected are those in what we call the global south, in other words, emerging economies, especially, as you said, in Africa and the Middle East. And it is going to result, in my opinion, in some fairly difficult circumstances that could lead to spot famine shortages in certain African economies. So what can be done? Well, certainly the international food agencies and the United Nations organizations are developing contingency plans to deal with this particular issue. But it's worth also mentioning that these grains and the price increases associated with the shortage of these grains will result in significant processed food price increases for European in particular, but also global consumers when they go to the supermarket shelf.
David, those concerns that are being expressed by the World Bank, they were echoed also by the director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva. She said she's being told that wheat and corn supplies are running low in many developing countries, the global south that John Quelch just referred to. What is the outlook in your view?
It's an extremely serious concern. And that's another knock-on effect of the Ukraine war. I think we'll have to look at some way of, in effect, sharing out supplies at some point to make sure that a lot more people don't go hungry. So there's the impact on food directly in terms of grain. There's the impact on fertilizers and then on food production elsewhere. For Europe as well, the really big impact is also in terms of energy costs, given that Europe is so reliant on Russian gas in particular. But there's all sorts of other knock-on effects. So, for example, Ukraine exports 50% of the world's chip-grade neon, which is used in making semiconductor chips, and that's likely to have a much bigger impact on, for example, the car industry. It was hoped before that the chip shortage would ameliorate any time now. It's likely to carry on for longer. So, we've had a world which has globalized, where we've got these long supply chains that cross borders many times. It's now being subjected to shocks. Many companies are thinking, well, how do we try and insulate ourselves from that? Can we source from other places, or can we bring supply chains nearer to home? So there's a big effort underway by many producers, not only in agriculture but also manufacturing, to think where they source from.
And David, I'm wondering how it could affect other countries that produce food. I mean, I saw this astounding figure that Brazil, for instance, gets 80% of its fertilizer from Russia, and it's not getting it right now.
Exactly. So some huge issues in terms of the supply of fertilizer, which is going to likely have an impact on food production around the world. And so I think food security is going to really go up the agenda and become a major issue. And it's really going to affect developing countries, but also in developed countries where for a while now, we've been talking about shifting agricultural policy towards things like public goods. I think we're going to start having to focus again on actual food supply.
John Gong, the White House is reviewing those tariffs that were imposed on China during the Trump era as a way of lowering domestic consumption prices. Here's President Biden.
Will you drop former President Trump's China tariffs?
We're discussing that right now. We're looking at what would have the most
To
positive
lower them or
impact.
to erase them?
No, I didn't say that.
I'm asking.
I'm telling you we're discussing it, and no decision has been made on it.
So, John Gong, is this a long overdue move? I mean, as we heard from our reporter at the beginning of the show, we could see the lifting of tariffs reduce inflation by 1.5%.
Absolutely, it should be long overdue that these tariffs should be removed. It does not make sense at all. I mean, if you look at the impact of these tariffs, they really haven't impacted, curtailed back, for example, China's exports to the United States over the last years. Other than just imposing a tax on American households to drive households to spend a few $100 more the whole year. Somewhere between $700 to $1,000 on average for American household because of these tariffs. It just doesn't make sense. It have to be gone long time ago. I'm so glad that President Biden's finally look into this. Now, let me also comment a little bit on the food prices and energy prices and also the fertilizers. Actually, the potash fertilizer that's being impacted the most. I think as the reality sinks in, there got to be some second thoughts about these hastily rushed out sanctions against Russia. I think there's a case to be made to make a distinction between the objective of weakening Russians' capability to continue this war versus making sure the supply of these strategic products on the international markets not going to be really adversely affected, especially for these quite poor developing countries that have consequences people's lives. And I have a prediction that historically sanctions do kill people actually, and I have a very dire prediction that this round of sanctions, I mean, this I would call it the mother of all sanctions, quoting Joe Biden's words, will kill people and will kill more people outside Ukraine than inside Ukraine. So that's something that I think politicians in these major Western capitals have to think about, and I think it's a legitimate concern here.
Ryan, of course, you have the U.S. slowdown right now, but how will that slowdown impact China's exports? I mean, could it get worse for China's export market if the U.S. growth rate slows down even more?
Yeah, I mean, you have the number one, number two economies in the world who need each other, which is really clear. I mean, the fact that the discussions about tariffs maybe decreasing will help both parties. And when the consumption, and really right now the U.S. price index and the consumer spending hasn't really taken a hit. They haven't really felt it yet, even though we're seeing prices increasing. I think if inflation continues to not reach its peak as of right now, you're going to see consumer buyout start to save more money, and that's going to start picking on all kinds of goods that we saw in the last, maybe 2 years ago when people were saving more than spending, and that then changes the way the behavior has been in the last 6 months.
John Quelch, of course, inflation hits retail prices, and earlier on I was saying something that would be on the minds of people would be when this inflation spiral would end and give us some relief. But something else that would be preoccupying people, especially people of a certain age group, is the stock market that's being hit right now, especially those people who depend on stocks for their retirement. At what point can we see some kind of turnaround on the stock market?
First of all, inflation is particularly deadly to folks who are on fixed incomes, many of them retirees. And although Social Security payments do increase, they increase on a lag to inflation. So there are many people who are in the vulnerable portion of the U.S. economy who are being squeezed very hard by inflation. And one area of inflation that hasn't been mentioned is the prices of rental accommodation, which have increased 20% on average across the U.S. in the past 2 years. And those rental prices, of course, fall primarily on people who are not homeowners at the lower income end of the market. Now, as far as the stock market is concerned, as I said earlier, the very rapid decline in the stock market does give pause to individuals in the higher net worth area of the economy who look at their monthly statements, see that there's been a significant fall, and then start thinking about perhaps postponing the vacation or buying a second-hand car instead of a new car when they trade their existing car in. So there are consumer behavior adjustments that are being forced and will take effect in terms of impacting demand as a result of the stock market valuation decline. But many economists would argue that there is still a way to go as far as that stock market decline is concerned, and potentially we've seen maybe 15% of the 25% that we could see in terms of the decline of the Dow and the S&P.
Right. So still lots of anxiety ahead. David, you were talking earlier on about the prospect of interest rate hikes in the United Kingdom. Well, let's look at Europe. Christine Lagarde, who is the president of the European Central Bank, she says she supports an interest rate hike in Europe, and most people say that is almost a certainty.
Yes, I think that's right. I think the ECB had been quite aggressive in terms of bond buying to try and stimulate the economy. It has to shift from stimulating the economy to trying to rein in inflation. So that means ending the bond buying program, starting to increase interest rates. One of the big problems, of course, in Europe is that there are some very heavily indebted countries, for example, Greece and Italy. So if the ECB stop buying bonds and start increasing interest rates, I think the impact of that will be felt most in those countries. And we're already seeing yields on bonds in, for example, Italy starting to rise. So the sort of impact of that will be quite differential across different parts of the Eurozone.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.